and I would also want to say a materialist supplement, but I won't go into that. It goes without saying that I don't think deconstruction is going to be a self-sustaining activity either. Well, to sum up, because it's about time I ended, structuralism looks like a promising strategy in the social sciences because it responds to the insight that the intelligible world doesn't have to be constituted in imitation of the material world. The human sciences don't have to be like the physical sciences. Indeed, the intelligible world is constituted, I would want to say, out of these structures, namely sets of relations entertained by intentional human subjects. Intelligible structures aren't even constrained by linguistic ones. That is to say, linguistic structures are only some among the intelligible structures. I think music is one of the most interesting cases of an intelligible structure, and that much more work perhaps needs to be done on the concept of significance in music, although there are people who are doing it. Since not only is it the case that there are non-linguistic structures, but that, how to put this, the language in which a text comes doesn't determine the intelligible structure to which it gives rise, which is another way of saying that texts are polysemic and that there's no one way of analyzing them, no single way of deconstructing. The final point I want to make has to do with the last twist in my title. Who needs deconstruction? And I think there are two answers to it, one of which I'll give, the other of which I will leave open as an exercise. I think that given that we are all the inheritors of, and all the victims of instruction, if you like, all the inheritors of traditional structures, philosophical, religious, nationalistic, and so on, as I said, not to mention linguistic, although language is less of an offender in a way, it's the vehicle for a lot of this stuff, but in itself, although it's always good to, have the kind of enlightenment that the Wolff-Sapir hypothesis constitutes, that is, that we are in a way victims of our own language. I think it would be a very good thing for everybody to know at least one non-Western, every Western person to know at least one non-Western language, or enough about one non-Western language to get some sense of the parochialism of the Western language in which he or she had grown up. Given that we are, therefore, the victims of instruction and the inheritors of these traditional structures, we need to be liberated from the obstructive character of them. I would say that deconstruction is something we all need. That's deconstruction in the sense that I take Descartes to have been a forerunner. And I think that it's useful to put it in that way as sort of imposing on people this task of self-deconstruction, if you like. But whether anybody really needs literary deconstruction, that's the exercise I'll leave to the reader.
Well, we're open for the exercise.
That's not the exercise you have to engage in. You do that on your own, yes. Well, no, I can say a bit more about that. You see, I'm not a structuralist, and actually, I tend not to be, or tend to think that unless you really come across something extraordinary, it's very unwise to commit yourself to it in that kind of way, to take the label. Because I think structuralism needs supplementing in at least two respects. I think it needs a materialist supplement, and I think it needs a phenomenological supplement. In the sense that unless there were a material world in which it was possible to have, in which, for example, brains exist and artifacts of other kinds and texts and whatnot, you wouldn't be able to have these social structures to which structuralist analysis is appropriate. And unless there were animating human subjects, as it were, then it wouldn't happen either, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of point. Once you've got those two things in place, once you see that, this is where I really began, it seemed to me very early on, I mean, there's the physical world and it has its properties, and that includes the biological world and whatever, what we find here and what we're made of and so on. And here's my subjectivity, and these things seem to me to be two surds. I don't know what it would be like to explain individual human subjectivity, one's own, nor do I know what it would be like to explain being in the sense of, you know, the old Leibniz-Heidegger question, you know, why should there be anything at all? Why not much rather nothing? So I think those are surds. Between these two surds, a world of significance is generated. Between these two meaningless poles, a world of meaning is constructed. And that world of meaning is constructed by virtue of the power of the subjects, nested as they are in their 30 billion neurons, to echo a theme of my talk last night, tackle one another and you know, tackle their projects in the world, if you like. Now, I'm not really trying to move structuralism in the direction of the phenomenological supplement. I want to sort of wave a little flag every now and then saying, don't forget the subject, don't forget intentionality, and so on, but I don't think that does anything much. Just as when I first started reading Sartre with these students, and having come as I had from physics and philosophy of science and logic, it seemed to me that something incredibly deep and profound happened to me, but it didn't really change any of the problems in the philosophy of science or logic that I was dealing with. I mean, it was a modal change rather than a change in content. It made a difference to the way I related to these things, but it didn't make a difference to them. Similarly, I think that structuralist analyses are what they are and can be carried on with more or less brilliance by people who do them, and deconstruction too, as far as that's concerned. And one doesn't need to keep saying or keep, so here I am, you know, there's the world and here am I, but those two things stand as sort of limits between which the enterprise goes on. So structuralism as such, I think, belongs in the middle there. And the supplement is only a supplement. It's not a supplement to it, as though it weren't structuralism without the supplement. I think it's quite fully structuralism as it is. But I think it needs to be supplemented if we're to have any sense of having a position adequate to the world we find ourselves in. I guess that's what I'd want to say. Did that get it all?
Well, it gets at your point. It doesn't completely satisfy my point. I guess if I had a follow-up, I guess I'd try to ask it another way. Like there's a phenomenologically oriented conception of life world, right, that really strikes me as having a bit of similarity to something you said when you talked about, well, before we can examine these structures, that the phenomenologist might not say we swallow structures whole, but he would say something like this, there's some pretty reflective, sort of holistic,
Right.
taken for granted world that's at the basis of structure. So they might like take it in the opposite direction. It seems that they'd be like, someone might say structuralism is the supplement to the phenomenological study, taking it from the other side.
No, I mean,
But I guess
I don't know. I mean, if because it always seemed to me that at least the life world as it comes up in the crisis, I mean, the last book of Husserl's, is something that sort of once grasped also changes a little bit one's orientation. Namely that it turns out that science and history and philosophy itself, even phenomenology as a philosophical procedure, are things that take place in the life world. And I would certainly want to say that structuralism is one of the ways of making that world intelligible. See, one thing that when I think of the sportscasters and these quick changes and so on that are going on, and all these exciting revolutions and so on, I keep thinking, when was the last revolution of philosophy really? And I think it was about Kant. I don't see any real revolution of philosophy since Kant, because I think what Kant did was to show us that we are subjects enclosed in the world of appearance. And what everybody's been trying to do since is to get out of that, to find an exit. And I don't think anybody's found one, nor do I think one is going to be found. But I do think that what a lot of people have been able to do is to sort of reorganize what's in there in perhaps more accessible and intelligible ways. And that's, I think, one of the things that structuralism can help to do.
So would you say it's impossible to think in a hermeneutic process in terms of structuralism?
Well, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, it's just a very, well, you said you want to, wave the little flag, and here I am, and I have to do something.
Actually, I didn't want to wave it very much, but every now and then. Yeah. Right, yeah.
So when you encounter something like structuralism, so nothing will happen to it, but something will happen to you. Now, this hermeneutic process in itself, do you think that can be put into structuralist terms?
Well, I think that there's a reasonable association between structuralism and certain kinds of hermeneutic activity, because just articulating the relations can show you sort of, as it were, channels of interpretation if you want. But I mean, I don't quite grasp the question though, because you said if you come across something structured, nothing will happen to it, but something will happen to you. What do you? Did I say that? I mean, did you think I said that? And, are you sure that's what I meant to say? I might sure that's what I meant to say. I realize I shouldn't put the question like that, but I mean, please remind me of where it was, because it's not. You see. Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. No. But you see, yeah, I understand. What I said wasn't. Really, you put it in a different context. What I said was the following: that there is a problematic, let's say in the philosophy of science. Let's say it's the problematic of degree of confirmation in the light of certain statistical evidence or something like that. And I'm doing this work, and I'm reading Carnap, and I'm doing Bayes' theorem and stuff like that. And somebody comes along and says, by the way, did you realize you were an anguished existential subject? And I say, gracious, I never thought of that. Wow, you're absolutely right. And then I go back to doing Bayes' theorem, and I'm still doing the same problem. That hasn't changed, that problem. That element of the given problematic remains exactly as it was. That's what I meant by saying something didn't happen to it, but happened to me. But the thing is, nothing was supposed to happen to it, in a way. That's to say, the question posed to me about my status as an existential subject doesn't have anything to do with this issue, which is something which, I mean, there's a sense in which my analysis is relevant to it, because, I mean, what I might want to do here, in fact, I think perhaps I'd better do it, since I used the word problematic, and I said the problematic remains. It might sound as if I was lending it a kind of objectivity after the manner of Karl Popper in Objective Knowledge or something like that, the World 3 stuff. And I absolutely reject that outright. I don't think there is any world. I mean, so you can use the language of World 3 if you like, but I think it's completely. It's not helpful in understanding what's going on, because it is quite true that I have to learn that problem. Let's say from Carnap or whoever it is, and other people have to learn it too. And each of us, that's one of the things that each of us is sustaining. But it's because it's part of it's part of the intentional domain in which we're operating. But the point is that the content of that domain is not changed by a certain kind of realization of my intentional relation to it. So that I don't take back the article I wrote about confirmation or anything like that, or I don't wave that flag over there when I'm talking to those people, don't you see? But I do think that hermeneutic activity can be informed by the methods of structural analysis, sure. That doesn't seem to be a problem. Is that an... Yes?
I think in terms of Russian and Czech structuralism,
Lotman?
The subject as being born with subject as content. The two concepts are come together, but Kovetsky thinks of the subject as having split it already. These two subjects were born. I was wondering if this is not a problem in time, in Heidegger's sense, when we see ourselves in a chronothesis, when we can reflect on ourselves internally, which does distinguish the activity of the humanities, our activity as human beings, humanism, from the physical sciences, because that is not like quantum-based theory or anything.
Yeah.
It's quite different, and it is quite artificial, and very difficult to prove that it's real. But we keep catching glimpses of ourselves in this way. We are startled by it, if you wish, experience anguish, and I think that literature is one of the things that one of the devices we develop to control these glimpses we get of ourselves as internally synthetic beings.
Right. Yeah.
But this wouldn't happen in science, I don't think at all.
But I don't think I would have wanted to suggest that it did. Because I do think that problems with the natural sciences, in which it's quite appropriate to take a realist position anyway, and to count on the world being there the next time you look, and that kind of thing, count on the results coming out the same way. What was that story that Hugh Kenner was telling last night about the Chinese or Japanese reader of Joyce, who said reality keeps it all together, something like that? Right. I mean, you see, there are some things that reality holds together. I mean, you could forget the physical sciences, and all the books could burn and so on, and you could be fairly sure that what the next generation, starting all over, would get would in fact be, at least under some translation, the same equivalent to what the previous generation got. And it seems to me that's a feature of the physical sciences that insufficiently recognized by people who like to take sort of radical relativistic views and say, well, science is just one way of looking at the world and poetry is another. You know, the thing is that the ways of looking do turn out to be mutually translatable up to a certain kind of convergence. This is not to take a view on realism, really, although I certainly would be prepared to argue that. But that's not at all the case with things in the social sciences. One wouldn't be at all sure that those structures would be reconstituted in anything like the same way if there were a really radical historical discontinuity. But as to the subject, I find that suggestion tremendously interesting, because there is obviously a sense in which our intentionalities aren't all sort of orthogonal to the plane of experience, or to the sort of, or as it were, to the axis of time, if you want to put it that way. And there's a place in the Crisis where Husserl talks about a kind of, what does he call it, lateral or longitudinal intentionality or something like that, in which the idea is that what we're looking at is our previous selves or something of that kind. And surely one would have to temporalize, say, make temporal, that's to say, attach a date to the, or not even a date, just attach the sort of token reflexive here and now to the subjectivity I'm talking about, because clearly one of the things I can be interested in is, the earlier conditions, even internal feelings or whatever about the experiences I previously had. And there is a tremendous difficulty there. It's in a way like a Derridian problem of origins. There always has to have been a subject. The origin of the subject is not something you're really going to find any illumination about.
Not how we discover ourselves as mind, in a certain sense.
Oh, sure.
They're really, this is obviously outside of the simple perception. We're talking about ourselves as the brain in terms of almost all of our perceptions. We're processing. But when we discover ourselves as a reflection, as recursiveness, time, we discover ourselves as mind.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, as I was saying yesterday, I really think the mind-brain problem is that extraordinary in the sense that I'm quite content to believe that the self who is now doing all these things is in fact, a very complex body. It's just that since its activity is subject of intentionality in a certain way, obviously if it wants to make itself an object, it can only do so with a little décalage. That's where the différence comes in, if you like. So that, but there's nothing surprising about that. It's a sort of condition of having a subject-object polarity in the first place.
For Chomsky's deconstruction of subject, because it causes a split subject.
Yeah, right.
I'm particularly interested in what you do with
Right.
structuralism.
Right.
Used to justify this, but it doesn't work philosophically.
I don't know. I mean, where is it that Chomsky talks about this problem?
He does.
Oh, I see. But his linguistics is the problem, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting thought. But it's a problem of a certain. It goes back as far as Kierkegaard. I mean, it goes back to whenever anybody's raised the question, how can how can I think about myself? How can I bring my subjectivity over into the object position? And the answer is you can't. But Freud has some stuff on that. Lacan has some stuff on it. But you can do it, as it were, just now. I mean, there's a sense in which Sartre's for itself is like that too. It isn't what it is, and it is what it isn't. That is, it can never come quite into self-identity with itself as and in itself. So there's always this sort of fleeting exteriority, or one's always a little bit in advance on oneself or something like that. I think it's quite extraordinary that it should happen. I mean, there should be a device, namely us, capable of this kind of activity. I'm rather grateful that it is the case. I think it's much better to be a conscious subject than not. But I don't, as I say, that's one of the things I don't think you're going to get an explanation for in other terms. It's one of the sort of conditions, the preconditions of having the game at all.
He has a question.
I'm interested in finding out more about the punchline of your title about who needs deconstruction, because I don't know a lot about deconstruction, but it seems to me that you say that it's in some way very similar to what Descartes does. It's a somewhat more subtle, somewhat more interior critical philosophy, and it makes no radical turn. It doesn't do anything more than a very stylish and also only applicable to certain texts criticism, and that it doesn't offer much for philosophy, and it's certainly not going to engender a revolution or engender a much closer presence of subject.
Mm.
And I mean, is that unfair? Do you think deconstruction is very limited?
Well, I mean, you're exaggerating very slightly the tone of what I said, but you've caught it pretty well, I think. I don't want, I mean, the exaggeration of tone is something I do want to dissociate myself from a little bit, because I do really rather respect and admire the work that deconstructive critics do. And the fact that I sometimes, I mean, I was thinking of the Yale Mafia, and going about like hitting texts with little geological hammers to see the faults, and then they come apart and so on. But I think that's, one would have to get rather deeply into the whole issue of the difference between literary criticism and philosophy in order to go much further with your question, I think. Because I do, deeply respect and admire what a lot of critics do, but I don't find that they work terribly well for philosophical texts. And if I'm a little bit flip at the end about who needs deconstruction of the literary kind, that's sort of partly a private joke. I mean, there's something there that certainly doesn't mean, it means that it isn't something that I find I want to spend a lot of time on, but that's true of a lot of other things, and that I respect perfectly well in their own domain. The non-applicability of deconstructive methods to many philosophical texts, I take it arises out of the fact that one of the principles of construction of philosophical texts is precisely to avoid a priori the sorts of fault and sliding and so on that are the things that deconstructionists go for. The fact that some of them yield to it anyway, I suppose, just means that the critic has found something that the writer didn't anticipate. But I don't know. Is that all? It's not perhaps a satisfactory answer to your question. But, you mean it isn't, or is it?
It's not.
It's not. Okay, push it a little bit. Can you?
Because you give a very negative formulation of deconstruction as fault and sliding, and obviously that is to a certain extent what's involved. But certainly wouldn't deconstructionists make a claim that their method, or that their, I don't even want to use the term method, but for lack of a better term, that it would apply, that it would be involved with any text, that it's the nature of texts as such. And you seem to be avoiding that whole issue, which seems to me fundamental.
Well, I mean, they might well say that, and I wouldn't resist if anybody wanted to do such a job on. I wouldn't say that. I'm not trying for a minute to say that philosophical texts are to be excused from this. Anybody who wanted to do such a job on the philosophical text, I'd say go to it. I think it's wonderful. I'd really be interested to see what happened. What you're saying reminds me of something that happened to me some time ago. I did a review of a book which is about Descartes, and was treating Descartes pretty much as a writer of a kind of literary text. And there is indeed a place in Descartes where he says that's what you're supposed to do. In the introduction of the Principles, he says, look, I tell you what, when you read this book, read it for the first time as if it were a novel. Tout ainsi comme un roman, he said. But the second time, go through and look to see what you didn't understand the first time. And then read it a third time with those things in mind. And if it's still unclear, read it the fourth. By the time you read it 5 or 6 times, you'll probably understand it. This is Descartes' way of telling you how to do philosophy. And it struck me that the distinction between first and second reading was a tremendously important distinction in this respect. Because it's perfectly all right to read a philosophical text for the first time as if it were a literary text. But by the time you get to the second reading, if you're doing it from a philosophical point of view, you're going to be looking for different kinds of things. And since I do philosophy, that's the way I would go about it. If somebody wanted to take any text in the world and read it for the second time in some other way, that seems to be perfectly all right. And I have absolutely not the slightest objection to that. And I'd love to see cases of it. And maybe there are some that I don't know. And if you can recommend some people who've done this kind of work on philosophical text, I'll rush and take a look at it. But I really didn't mean to say, you see, how to put this again? I think there are certain things about language and language becoming text that certainly are going to be true of every human activity of the making of text. And whatever they are, then all text will fall under them. From that point of view, quite right. But there are other things going on in text as well, at a level that isn't going to be reached by deconstructive practice as I've encountered it, but which have to do with structures of argument and that kind of thing that philosophers deal with. And not everything you want to do with the text would come out of that particular methodology or that particular approach. But as I say, that doesn't prevent any deconstructive critic from dealing with any text he or she wants. Yes?
Related to that question, I was wondering whether you thought that there was any future for deconstruction, particularly considering it's such a recent intellectual import into North America. Besides as a philosophical or literary exercise, what I'm thinking of is the possibility for deconstruction to be used as a social or an institutional critique, something along the lines of Michael Ryan has tried to do by grafting Marxism to deconstruction, or the use that it's been put to by certain feminists as a way of disrupting patriarchal structures.
I don't see why not. It seems fine to me. But then, you see, one thing I'm not really sure of, and this goes back to the earlier question, so maybe we can keep this conversation going for just another minute. I wasn't trying to do anything reductive at all by trying to fit deconstruction into a structuralist context. Because I think that's a tremendously precious insight that Heidegger had, Derrida had, and so on, that I rephrase by saying, look, you never just learn the language, you always also learn things that are said in it. That's to say, it always comes prejudiced in a certain way. And this for all texts, and I agree with that. So I really meant to say, I think deconstruction in this sense, in this general sense, is terribly, terribly important. I think that literary deconstruction is a special case of it, which, like nearly all literary special cases of things, takes on its own character and has its own schools and so on. And the idea that a roughly deconstructive approach could be taken to these other questions seems to me absolutely fine, and probably, in effect, I was trying to say, even necessary.
Just like to take exception, one thing you said about deconstruction, that was that it was applicable as far as philosophical texts went to self-reflexive texts of the kind you get in modern philosophy, that is to say, post-19th century, perhaps, or at least post-18th. But Derrida has applied it in a brilliant way to Plato in that paper, that long paper on Plato's
The Pharmacon. Yes, right.
And he's done it with Aristotle, too, on being and predication. And he's done it, of course, with Descartes several times.
Yeah.
Now, you might want to include Descartes in your modern reflexive category, but you probably couldn't do that with Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, okay. I suppose, one thing I want to ask is, just because Derrida did it, I suppose it's not necessarily to think of it as deconstructive. Although...
I think the Plato Pharmacon is. Actually, the Aristotle one on Lucia is too.
Yeah.
It brings in not the kind of supplement that was talked about earlier, but what Derrida calls the dangerous supplement.
Sure,
the one
sure.
that's suppressed.
Yeah. No, but you see, I'm quite sure how to put this. There's a sense, I admire tremendously Derrida's Pharmacon paper, and I think these are absolutely brilliant treatments of really important texts. What he brings to bear is a tremendous depth of learning, philosophical and philological. And if you want to say, look, that's kind of this articulation of these texts, certainly not in a merely textual setting, but in a rich historical setting. If you want to say that's a deconstructive activity, I guess that's all right with me. Because I can always fall back on my equivalents of deconstruction and analysis. When Heidegger says loosening up, and as I was pointing out last night, the word analysis means up loosening. Any philosophical treatment is going to consist, anything that doesn't just repeat the text, is going to be an activity of manipulating the text in a certain way, pushing it around, saying, finding things in it, finding connections between it and other textual connections between it and its language, or between it and its world, and so on. And if all that is deconstructive activity, okay, it looks to me, though, as if we've just relabeled something that I would think didn't need that label. Partly because there is in the the work of Demant and Miller and Barbara Johnson and people like that, an activity which is I would say, much more specifically contemporary deconstruction. We've learned a lot from Derrida. I don't deny that, obviously. I mean, you're absolutely right. I was just thinking of certain philosophical texts which are, as it were, also in a certain way literary, which is why I mentioned Nietzsche and even Wittgenstein in a sense, because there is this tremendous sort of self-reflective character in Wittgenstein. But I certainly don't have any particular objection to, in a way, it gives me a chance to repeat what I was saying here, that it's not of tremendous importance to me that something could be called deconstruction or not, but I certainly didn't want to give the impression that there were texts inaccessible to any particular kind of critical treatment.
I think there was more questions that already been asked.
Okay. Well, I want to thank in particular the Department of Philosophy for co-sponsoring this lecture on structuralism, and in a good structuralist manner I'll announce that there was a binary aspect to this, a binary relationship, and I've been carefully avoiding the word opposition here. Marianne Caws will speak at 4 o'clock on framing the text, which would be the lit-crit aspect of this, and the philosophers are certainly welcome to stay. Thank you.